I have lived long enough to watch the rules around money change several times. That is one of the few things the public consistently underestimates. People imagine that financial advice is carved in stone, handed down from responsible adults to younger ones, and meant to last forever. Save this way, buy a house when you can, work hard and you will rise, avoid debt. Rent is wasted money. A stable job is safer than a turbulent one. Passion will somehow become profit if you just believe hard enough. People inherit these lines the way they inherit old furniture. They do not examine them. They carry them into a new decade, a new economy, a new labor market, a new housing market, a new technology wave, and then wonder why the old map no longer gets them where they were promised it would. The map changed, or more precisely the territory changed, and they kept using the old map. That is one reason so many people now feel betrayed by money. They think the problem is personal. They think they failed the system. Sometimes the truth is simpler and more useful. They are obeying scripts that belong to a different market, a different cost structure, a different era of leverage, wages, and opportunity. They are trying to win a new game with old rules. That is expensive. I have no patience for expensive nostalgia. If I had to reduce the entire subject to a single principle, it would be this. Money is not only arithmetic. Money is adaptation. The person who survives and eventually thrives is usually not the person with the cleanest slogans. It is the person who notices when the rules changed, learns the new game faster than the crowd, and then acts without wasting 10 years complaining that things should feel easier. That may sound cold. It is not cold. It is merciful. Because once you accept that the rules changed, you stop wasting your energy waiting for the old world to come back. Waiting is what ruins people. They wait for the housing market to feel like their parents' era. They wait for wages to catch up. They wait for the perfect time to invest. They wait for work to reward effort the old way. They wait for their savings account to feel safer than inflation. They wait for the economy to become normal again. Meanwhile, the people who adapt keep moving. They renegotiate. They learn. They change structures. They use tools the older scripts never taught them to use. They build in the world that actually exists. That is where I want to live. In the world that exists, not the one that would be emotionally easier to explain. The first place this matters is in how people think about hard times. A lot of people see a rough market and immediately translate it into one message. Danger, stop, freeze, stay small, wait until confidence returns. That is a very human reaction. It is also one of the reasons wealth clusters around a minority, because the minority sees something else. They see that hard times do not only destroy value, they also reprice value. Pain has a way of creating discounts. Fear has a way of pushing some assets, businesses, and opportunities below what calmer buyers might pay later. That is what I have always meant when I say that you should be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. It is not a slogan to impress undergraduates. It is a warning against emotional synchronization with the crowd. The crowd buys comfort at the top and sells fear at the bottom, because the crowd experiences price and emotion as the same event. I never wanted to live that way. I wanted to notice when discomfort itself had made certain things cheaper. You do not need to be reckless to think this way. You need to be prepared. That is why hard markets are not only periods of pain, they are tests of readiness. If you have cash, credit, judgment, and patience when other people have only stress, you can do things they cannot do. You can buy, you can negotiate, you can wait, you can move, you can begin. A lot of people talk about opportunity as if opportunity is some abstract blessing. Usually opportunity is concrete. It is the deal nobody else can take because nobody else has room. That is why financial literacy matters so much. It is not because knowledge makes you sound impressive. It is because knowledge creates room. If you do not understand money, then every shift in the economy feels like random weather. You are simply outside in the rain hoping not to get sick. The same environment becomes more legible, still difficult perhaps. But legible, you begin to see that the hard market is also a discount market, that a rough economy is also a negotiation economy, that a painful credit cycle is also a moment when disciplined people can use other people's retreat to their own advantage. That is the difference between panic and fluency. And money is very much a language. If I dropped you into a country whose language you did not speak, you could probably survive. You could point. You could smile. You could overpay. You could misunderstand. You could get from one day to the next. But you would not have much leverage. You would not catch nuance. You would not know when someone was giving you a terrible deal. You would not know how to negotiate. You would not know which rules were rigid and which were flexible. You would not know where the danger actually was and where it only sounded dangerous because of your own ignorance. That is where a lot of adults are living financially. They are surviving inside a language they never learned. And because they never learned it, they are often operating under several disastrous assumptions at once. They assume debt is one thing. They assume renting is a moral failure. They assume hard work automatically becomes wealth. They assume every downturn is a personal warning rather than a market condition. They assume passive income means easy money. They assume business is for people with capital already, not for people who know how to attract it. They assume great careers belong to the most loyal workers rather than the clearest value creators. And then, when reality behaves differently, they do not revise the assumptions. They simply feel betrayed. I would rather revise the assumptions. Take housing, for example. Few myths have survived longer than the mythology of homeownership. Buy a house, people say, stop throwing money away on rent. That sentence may once have been closer to universally useful. It is not universally useful. Now, if home prices race ahead of wages, rates climb, and the total carrying cost of ownership begins absorbing your flexibility, then buying is not automatically maturity. It may be the most culturally approved way to become financially rigid. That is a very different thing. I do not care about the moral theater around buying versus renting. I care about the math. If renting gives you mobility, lower maintenance burden, more liquid reserves, and the ability to invest aggressively while the purchase math in your city makes no sense, then renting is not losing. It is adapting. If buying gives you stability, emotional grounding, and a cost profile that genuinely works in your favor, then buying can be excellent. But the world is full of people forcing themselves into a bad purchase because they are frightened of being seen as unserious adults. That is too expensive a fear. Math does not care whether a purchase is symbolic. It cares whether the structure works. The same kind of confusion appears around credit and debt. People still speak about debit as though it were morally pure and credit as though it were the gateway drug of modern foolishness. That is not a serious way to think. Credit used badly is poison. Credit used well is infrastructure. It builds history. It expands access. It adds fraud protections. It can create perks and short-term flexibility in a system where your credit record affects apartments, cars, mortgages, and sometimes the simple dignity of smoother transactions. Refusing to understand credit because it scares you is not prudence. It is self-handicapping. What matters is not whether the card says debit or credit. What matters is whether the person using it has judgment. That is why I always separate debt by purpose and structure. Personal debt used to support consumption and image is one thing. Strategic leverage used to control productive assets is another. A celebrity borrowing against valuable assets or a business using debt to finance growth is not doing the same thing as an ordinary person financing an inflated lifestyle. The public sees the shared word debt and assumes the same moral story is unfolding. It is not. And if you do not understand that, you cannot really understand how wealth is built in the modern world. Because one of the oldest lies people still believe is that hard work alone is enough. I admire hard work. I admire obsession even more. But I have watched enough industries evolve to know that the link between effort and wealth is much weaker than people want it to be. If hard work were the master key, physical laborers and the most exhausted service workers would dominate the wealth tables. They do not. Wealth tends to flow toward ownership, leverage, systems, rarity, and scale. Effort matters, but effort alone, detached from structure and leverage, is often just a slower way to stay tired. That truth makes some people angry. Fine, I have no use for anger. if it keeps you financially illiterate. I would rather ask the profitable question, if raw effort does not automatically create wealth, then what game am I really in? That question changes everything because it forces you to stop romanticizing how the world should work and start observing how it does work. It forces you to ask how your employer makes money. It forces you to ask what your skill is worth in the current market, not in the fantasy market inside your head. It forces you to ask whether your passion has demand behind it or merely emotional importance to you. It forces you to ask whether you are building a scalable system or simply selling hours until your body gets tired. Those are adult questions, and adult questions make money clearer. That is why I have always admired people who solve pain. In companies, in markets, in businesses, in products, in operations. Money follows solve pain more reliably than it follows charm. That is one reason I like the distinction between fixers and freeloaders. A fixer sees the leak and starts working. A freeloader sees the leak and starts explaining. A fixer becomes useful. A freeloader becomes heavy. Organizations, partnerships, and markets all have a way of eventually paying people according to which one they are. This is true at work too. If you want to earn more, then you should be able to answer a very uncomfortable question. How do I make my employer money right now? Not how hard do I work? Not how nice am I? Not how long have I been loyal? How do I reduce cost, increase revenue, prevent loss, accelerate output, or solve pain that someone above me urgently wants solved? Compensation tends to rise much faster when value becomes clear in those terms than when you merely hope someone notices your effort and decides to be kind. Kindness is not a compensation system. Value is. That is why I often think people should spend less time announcing ambition and more time learning the rules of the game they are in. I have seen people leave decent situations too early because they never really learned how to read the opportunity inside them. I have also seen people stay in dead situations far too long because familiarity felt safer than adaptation. Neither extreme is wise. What matters is whether you understand where who wins if you solve it, who pays if you stay the same. This matters enormously in entrepreneurship. One of the most limiting sentences people speak is, "I don't have the money." Sometimes that is literally true, but often it is only partially true. The richer and more useful sentence is, "I do not yet know how to access the money." Those are not identical statements. The wealthiest people in the world rarely fund everything with their own cash. They use lenders, investors, grants, incentives, structured loans, partnerships, and forms of outside capital. That does not mean capital is easy to get. It means access to capital is a skill. And many people never learn the skill because they stop at the first sentence. "I don't have the money." That line kills a lot of businesses before they are even thought through properly. There is a whole ecosystem around capital grants. Small business programs, private investors, revenue-based financing, partnerships, bank products, community funding, industry money. But the world does not hand these things to vague people with fuzzy plans. Capital wants operators. It wants clarity. It wants unit economics. It wants conviction tied to competence. It wants to believe that the person in front of it knows what game he is in. That is why I am not moved by the phrase, "follow your passion," unless passion is accompanied by a market. Passion alone is often just an expensive form of self-expression. Profit requires demand. It requires solving something people care enough about to pay for. Sometimes the overlap between passion and profit is beautiful. Sometimes it is narrow. Sometimes it does not exist at all. A mature person can face that without feeling personally attacked by reality. I respect people who can do that, because reality becomes much more usable once you stop demanding that. It flatters your preferences. That is also called boring businesses. Everyone wants sexy industries. Everyone wants the story they can tell at dinner. But money often pools in neglected places, precisely because fewer people chase status there. Operations, logistics, data, insurance, waste, maintenance, niche services, compliance, infrastructure, distribution. Systems nobody daydreamed about in college, but everybody depends on in real life. The world pays for solved necessity long after it stops applauding it. I have never needed applause from a business. I needed economics. And in this era, that discipline matters more than ever. More people can produce. More tools exist. More AI can create the appearance of competence. More content floods the same channels. More average execution arrives everywhere, which means the premium shifts. It shifts toward judgment, toward design, toward diagnosis, toward timing, toward obsession, toward the ability to see patterns others miss, and to keep caring long enough that your repetitions become rare. That is why obsession is such a valuable economic asset. Not hustle theater, not motivational busyness obsession. People who love the game deeply enough to learn its rules usually outrun people who merely want the rewards. They stay when it gets dull. They notice when the rules shift. They do not romanticize fairness so much that they stop learning how to win inside what is real. They do not pout at the algorithm forever. They study it. They do not whine that the market changed. They learn the new market. They do not complain that a game became more competitive. They decide whether the game is still worth playing, and if it is, they change their play. That is adult adaptation. And it is one reason environment matters so much. Spend enough time around people who treat money like mystery, and you will eventually think confusion is normal. Spend enough time around people who treat money as learnable, structural, and negotiable, and the room changes. Your questions change. Your ceiling changes. Your tolerance for vagueness drops. Humans borrow possibility from one another all the time. That is why I would rather spend time with builders, investors, operators, and fixers than with people who make a full-time hobby out of explaining why the world should have been easier. Explanations rarely compound, systems do. And systems are what money is about in the end. Not morality, not self-image, not me-down scripts from older decades. Not the social performance of looking smart with money. A person can look smart and still be structurally weak. I am not interested in looking smart. I am interested in becoming harder to corner, harder to fool, harder to panic, harder to separate from cash, leverage, and opportunity, because I actually understand the rules well enough to act when the room gets uncomfortable. That is what good money knowledge buys you. Not certainty, legibility, it makes the world legible. A hard market stops being only a threat and starts becoming a discount table you may or may not be ready to shop. A rent decision stops being an identity statement and becomes a math problem. A credit card stops being a moral symbol and becomes either a useful tool or a loaded weapon. Depending on the hands, debt stops being one word and starts becoming categories. Hard work stops being a religion and becomes one ingredient among several. Passive income stops sounding magical and starts sounding like a system somebody built, funded, and maintained. Business stops looking like a rich person's game and starts looking like a solvable series of capital, demand, and execution questions. The economy stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like terrain. That is a very different life. And if I had to leave one final instruction, it would: do not keep living by old money scripts just because they were repeated with confidence. Interrogate them. Replace the ones that no longer fit the world you are in. Learn the language. Respect the rules. Become a fixer. Let hard times teach you where discounts are, not only where fear is. Let leverage teach you structure, not merely danger. Let credit teach you access, not merely. Let work teach you which game you are really in. Let money become a tool instead of a moral fog. Because once the world becomes legible, something powerful happens. You stop reacting like a tourist. You start moving like an owner. And owners over time tend to do very well.